Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Salem, Massachusetts. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The winter of 1873 came early to Essex County. A gray sea wind pressed up the streets of Salem and rattled the shutters of Broad Street before dusk. Our subject, Deputy Marshal Ira Collings, arrived with a carpet satchel of warrants, 2 folded broadsheets, and a quiet instruction from the county clerk. Look again at the Calder house. In the faded minutes of the clerk's ledger, the Calder name had a short, respectable line: hardware importers, charitable subscribers, pew holders. Yet a second column, written in a later hand, bore a single notation: domestic disturbances, unsubstantiated. Collings's first impression of the property, a salt-stained mansion just north of Gallows Hill, was that it did not belong to any present century. It seemed to lean away from the road, as if listening for a footstep on the gravel path that never came. Early in his notes, Collings wrote something practical that reads like a warning. Salem's history lives under every board. He was not wrong. Local ministers and schoolmasters kept their own collections of clippings and sermons, and many still reference the old notoriety of the town, not the fevered myth, but the long aftertaste of it. In parish talk and courthouse whispers, Salem was the place where silence learned to pass for virtue. The deputy used that understanding the way a mariner reads a shoal. It told him where not to step and whom not to ask first. The Calders had purchased the house from a retired ship's chandler named Horace Bly. Before that, the land had belonged to the Lovewell family, peppered through old tax rolls, with notations like absent at sea and declined to answer. Neighbors along Charter Street called the Calders industrious, then lowered their voices. Mrs. Eunice Hart, dressmaker, said, "They keep a late kitchen fire." Mr. Andrew Pike, sexton of the nearby burying ground, gave a more pointed remark. "The daughter is pale from the weather, or else from something she mustn't say." The daughter's name was Lydia Calder, the son Matthew, the father Gilead. Broad-shouldered, courteous, and so measured in speech that one felt each reply had been boiled down like syrup from a larger truth. The first incidents did not present as crimes. A milk cart found half unloaded behind the Calder alley one wet morning, a box of nails left open to the rain, a child's ribbon snagged on a fence. In the ledger of minor complaints, Collings copied a washerwoman's report of odd noises after the first bell of 9, metal upon stone, like a pan dragged slow. That same week, the sexton Pike swore before Justice Vose that a small strip of ground behind the Calder backlot showed disturbances, not from frost heave, more like a labored shuffling and the grass pressed smooth. No one spoke of graves, not yet, only of soil that did not remember how it had been laid. When the deputy asked at the Athenaeum for earlier references to the Calder name, a librarian produced a clipping from 1868, Gilead Calder's donation to the Widow's Fund, a brief notice of thanks, and nothing else. It was the thinness of it that troubled Collings. Families in Salem, even the quiet ones, left a paper smell behind them. Church rosters, shipping manifests, line items for lamp oil. The Calders, by contrast, occupied 4 rooms in the town's memory and seemed to deny the rest. In his evening entry, Collings wrote, "This place keeps records the way the sea keeps ships." He added, almost as if to anchor his thoughts, "Sal's M's past teaches us that public silence is not proof of private innocence." The following week brought steady rain that turned the harbor streets to channels of black water. The Calder house, viewed through that gray veil, seemed less a residence than a patient thing under observation. Deputy Collings returned with a clerk from the coroner's office, Mr. Amos Reeve, to take measurements around the back lot. They found no signs of trespass, yet the soil near the outbuilding was compacted into shallow depressions, as if something heavy had been set down and later removed. Reeve's report noted traces of burlap fiber, common to shipping sacks, adhering to the damp earth. The constable's lantern uncovered fragments of porcelain, 2 lengths of thin chain, and a half-rotted scrap of muslin embroidered with the initials L.C., presumably for Lydia Calder. When Collings asked her about it the next morning, she said only, My name belongs to the house." Her voice had the flat tone of someone reciting from a lesson learned too young to forget. Neighbors began to close their shutters earlier. The baker's wife remarked that she saw Gilead Calder walking toward the burying ground after dark, carrying something wrapped against his chest. Another man, a carter named Josiah Dean, testified that he heard the Calder's dog barking steadily through midnight until it stopped with a short, high yelp. By dawn, the dog was gone. Collings's second inspection found faint scratches on the doorframe leading to the cellar. At his request, the floorboards were lifted. Beneath lay a cramped brick vault, dry and odorless, containing a crate of hardware nails, 2 folded blankets, and a length of stained rope coiled neatly like a sermon's conclusion. Nothing criminal could yet be proved. Still, the deputy wrote in his log, "If guilt has a scent, it has learned to disguise itself here." He visited the Salem Athenaeum again, tracing mentions of the Calder family through ship-reg, histories and church rosters. In an 1854 pamphlet on the town's mercantile donors, he found the name Gilead Calder appended to a gift toward the rebuilding of a schoolhouse lost to fire. Below it, in another hand, someone had penciled a single phrase, "Reformed, not absolved." It was a moral comment, but from whom and for what, none could say. Local memory reached backward to the town's older sins, and Collings, weary of superstition, cited the same lessons scholars often drew from Salem's notorious trials a century earlier, that suspicion thrives where records grow thin. Yet, it comforted no one that these new unearthed matters echoed that older heritage of concealment. He returned to the house once more at dusk. Lydia met him in the parlor, where portraits of unknown faces watched from their oval frames. "People say unkind things about this place," he told her. She answered, "It is the place that remembers, not the people." Her eyes followed the flicker of the lantern, as if something moved behind its light. That night, Collings wrote his last clear entry before the case turned inward. The daughter speaks as though the walls themselves keep confession. 3 nights later, the tide brought in a smell of brine and decay that hung over the wharf and drifted up Charter Street like a slow procession. Collings, roused by a messenger from the night watch, was led to the marsh side, where a fisherman had found what appeared to be fragments of burial cloth tangled in eelgrass. They bore the same embroidery thread as the muslin from the Calder cellar. The fisherman, Elijah Morse, told the deputy he had seen a man in a dark coat wading knee-deep near the pier 2 evenings prior, moving as if counting steps. When asked if he could name him, Morse shook his head but added, "He carried himself like someone who knew where the bottom was." The evidence, slight as it was, tightened the circle around Gilead Calder. Inside the house, Collings noted a growing disorder. Unopened letters on the table, soot streaks above the hearth, and a portrait turned face to the wall. Lydia avoided the lower floors, while her brother Matthew spent long hours in the garden, even during rain. Their speech to each other had become careful, almost legal, each question answered by a half-sentence. It was around this time that Collings revisited his earlier reference, the long shadow of Salem's moral heritage, mentioning to his superiors that the same pattern of whispered sin and official hesitation seemed to repeat itself. He drew an uneasy comparison to those chronicled in Salem's earlier era of judgment, when silence had been mistaken for faith. A minor clerk, overhearing, remarked, "Every generation invents its own kind of witch." By the second week of December, the Calder property smelled of oil and damp plaster. Servants had left without notice. A single lamp burned through the night in the upstairs study, where Gilead was said to pore over ledgers from his trading years. One entry in a surviving notebook, preserved later by county archivists, read, "To make clean again requires more than washing." It was written beneath a list of hardware shipments that ended abruptly in 1869. That same year, the family's mother had died of what the parish register called lung failure following confinement. No grave under her name could be found within the town limits. When Collings inquired, the church sexton only shrugged. It was arranged privately. This phrase appeared again in later depositions. On December 14th, the deputy secured a warrant to search the rear garden. The frost had hardened the ground, but near the elm fence the soil was softer. Beneath 6 inches of earth, they found a small wooden box containing rosary beads, a cracked ivory comb, and a faded scrap of newspaper folded around a curl of dark hair. The paper bore a date from 1870 and an advertisement for a boarding house in Marblehead. Collings held the comb to the lantern and noted the initials burned faintly into the back, H.C. It was the first suggestion that another Calder, one not listed among the living, had once resided there. The discovery was entered quietly into the record, yet the town learned of it within a day. Salem's Gazette printed a small notice beneath the market prices. Unusual find in the Calder grounds. Authorities decline comment. From that moment, the air around the family seemed charged. Lydia ceased attending Sunday service. Matthew was seen loading trunks into a borrowed cart before dawn, and Gilead, according to the postmaster, closed his account without explanation. Collings visited the house once more on the pretext of inventory. He found Lydia alone, her hands raw from scrubbing the parlor floor, though no stain was visible. When asked about the initials on the ivory comb, she whispered, "It belonged to Mother. Father said she was too frail for the winter sea." Collings made no reply, but in his private notes he added a reference from an earlier inquest report. An incident in 1869, when a small cargo vessel, the Agnes Lee, was lost off the Massachusetts coast with one female passenger unregistered by name. The vessel's home port was Salem. The connection was circumstantial, yet it carried the same undertone found in every Calder document, something omitted by design. Collings forwarded his suspicions to the county coroner, whose attention was already divided by a rash of influenza deaths. Weeks passed with no directive. In January, the house was found deserted. The hearth was cold, the furniture draped in sheets, and the study drawer left open, containing only a single envelope marked, "For the Deputy." Inside was a folded page of family scripture with a verse underlined. "The earth shall disclose her blood, and shall no more cover her slain." Collings reread it under lamplight until dawn, uncertain whether it was confession or warning. In the following days, tracks were sighted along the frozen shore leading toward Marblehead. Local fishermen reported a man and woman traveling, with a covered crate on a hired sloop bound south, but records of their landing were lost in the February storm that damaged the harbor office. When spring thawed the ground again, the Calder house showed signs of intrusion, footprints, a lantern wick still damp with oil, and faint writing scratched into the cellar beam. "Remember H.C." The phrase recurred later in a teacher's journal from 1881, noting that schoolchildren playing near the ruins spoke of the lady who knocks from below when it rains. Collings, now retired, revisited the site once more before his death. He wrote that the soil no longer smelled of rot, only of salt and iron, but he could not shake the sense that something remained beneath it, something the town preferred to keep unnamed. He mentioned Salem's older chronicles again, observing that history there was less a sequence than a recurrence. The Calder matter was never reopened. The property burned in 1884, cause unknown, and with it whatever records remained. Yet on damp evenings the marsh wind carries a sound like paper turning in a drawer, as if an unseen clerk still amends the ledger of the hidden family sin. When later generations tried to reconstruct the Calder file, they found only fragments, an affidavit unsigned, an inventory list eaten by damp, and Collings's weathered notebook. The first line had faded, but the ink grooves suggested it once read, "In Salem, silence has a pulse." County clerks in the 1890s reviewed what little remained, attempting to index the Calder name among defunct estates. One clerk, Mr. Jonas Wetherill, noted that no burial taxes were ever recorded for any member of the family after 1872. He also found a mortgage transfer dated 6 months before their disappearance, selling the house to a fictitious trust. The handwriting matched Gilead's own. These discoveries reignited local rumor. Tavern talk revived the idea that the Calders had trafficked in something beyond trade goods, perhaps human remains, perhaps medical curiosities, perhaps penance itself. Theories bloomed and decayed as quickly as they were told. What endured were the smaller observations. that the soil of the property never froze evenly, that animals avoided its boundary, and that the nearby church bell sometimes struck once past the hour, as if to count something unacknowledged. A brief mention of the case appeared in an 1895 academic paper examining moral hysteria in post-Puritan communities. The author referenced the Calder affair alongside the lingering moral rigor that defined places like Salem. He wrote that, "These towns are museums of their own conscience." It was an unkind phrase, but fitting. When a team of surveyors mapped the remaining lots after the 1884 fire, they found the Calder foundation sunken into the ground, half swallowed by reeds. In the mud were shards of porcelain similar to those once noted by Collings. A single button rusted through its center was taken as evidence of nothing and filed without location. By 1900, the site had been overgrown, its boundaries blurred by new fences and small tenant gardens. The Calders became a parable told to strangers. Do not let your secrets sleep too near the sea. Local children recited it as rhyme without understanding. The last witness with first-hand knowledge, an elderly washerwoman named Eunice Hart, was interviewed before her death in 1907. She said she still dreamed of Lydia Calder standing by the garden gate, neither aged nor altered, watching the tide roll back. She never blinked, Eunice told them, as if waiting for the water to return something. The statement was dismissed as senile fancy, but her words matched an older pattern in the town's folklore, stories of the sea reclaiming its debts. And so the Calder case remained an unfinished entry in Salem's archive, one more echo beneath the weight of its own history. Some evenings, when fog settles low along Broad Street, the air seems to hum faintly, like breath drawn before confession. Those who have lived long in Salem say it is only the wind across the harbor. Others, less certain, prefer not to speak when it happens, fearing that silence, once broken, might finally answer back. A few of Collings's papers surfaced again in 1915, long after his death, discovered in a locked drawer of the old courthouse slated for demolition. They were brittle but legible, sealed within a water-stained envelope marked "Private, Do Not Index." Inside were his sketches of the Calder house and several notes written in a trembling hand. One described a faint humming heard in the cellar whenever the tide turned. Another recorded his dream of walking through the garden, while a voice whispered from the ground, "Not buried, only kept." Among the papers was a clipping from the 1870s listing donations to the town's small museum. One entry noted the acquisition of maritime specimens from G. Calder's son. The museum's later catalog, checked by historians, contained no such items. Collings had underlined the line twice and written beside it, "Removed before inventory." This discovery renewed interest in the family's possible trade in medical or anatomical materials, a quiet commerce that had occasionally surfaced in New England during that period. Scholars comparing the case to other instances in Essex County cited the earlier notoriety of Salem's past as context for the public's reluctance to probe further. They mentioned how the town, still conscious of its name's association with judgment, preferred omission to inquiry. By the 1920s, the Calder story had been folded into local tours and pamphlets, its dates blurred and its name softened. Guides spoke of "the merchant who could not let go," or "the house that wept salt." Only in private circles did the phrase "hidden family sin" persist, whispered by archivists who had seen the unindexed papers. The last physical trace of the family, an iron key labeled "Rear Vault," was catalogued without accession number and misplaced within the museum's basement shelving. When a young historian, Helen Vos, attempted to locate it in 1932, she found the reference card missing, though its outline remained faintly imprinted on the file drawer. She later wrote that the loss felt deliberate, as if the object had been withdrawn from memory itself. In her notes, she compared the incident to what earlier chroniclers had observed about Salem's conscience, that forgetting there was an active process, not a passive one. Even now, on certain damp nights, those who walk past the site where the Calder house once stood claim to hear the rattle of chain or the faint knock of wood beneath the soil, though no excavation has ever confirmed a cause. The wind off the harbor carries it inland, low and rhythmic, like breath against a door. And in that sound, the town's long tradition continues, the quiet maintenance of what it cannot forgive, and the endless bookkeeping of its hidden family sin. By the mid-1930s, the Calder story had already become a local caution, whispered more than written. Teachers spoke of it when fog rolled in before dusk. Merchants avoided the subject entirely, and the museum guides refused to name the family in their tours. Yet fragments persisted in unexpected places. A sailor's diary recovered from an abandoned wharf chest in Gloucester contained a short entry dated 1872. Took on one crate, heavy, from Calder man, said not to open till Charleston. The crate's number matched a manifest found decades later in a Boston archive, though the receiving entry was blank. The historian Helen Vose, still chasing the case, presented these links in a lecture to the Historical Society, suggesting that the Calder secret might have been maritime rather than domestic. She noted that medical colleges along the coast had quietly purchased preserved specimens during that period, often without recording their origin. Her remarks met polite silence, after which the Society declined to publish the paper. Within months, Vose left Salem for Maine, claiming her research notes had been stolen from her boarding room. What she left behind was a map with the Calder property marked by a faint red circle and a single word beside it, still. In 1939, workers expanding the sewer line near Broad Street struck a stone chamber 2 feet below grade. It contained nothing more than a rusted hinge and a square of iron lattice, but the engineer's report mentioned that the surrounding soil was unusually saline. The workmen refused to continue that day, saying their lamps dimmed each time they descended. The report ended with the practical remark, "Area resealed due to instability." It has remained undisturbed since. During the war years that followed, Salem changed, and the old sections near Gallows Hill were largely cleared. Yet older residents swore that each spring, when the thaw returned, the ground at the Calder site exhaled a faint smell of oil and seaweed. A few likened it to the odor once noted by Deputy Collings in his last report. The coincidence drew brief attention from a visiting journalist who later wrote, "Some towns bury their history. Salem lets it breathe through the cracks." His editor removed the line before publication. As the century turned, descendants of those who had once testified in the original inquiry began to die off, and with them the oral memory that kept the story anchored. Still, those who sorted through their attics sometimes found odd keepsakes: a lock of hair sealed in glass, a nail wrapped in cloth, or a ledger page without heading. Each item bore a weight of secrecy too deliberate to discard. Even now, beneath modern pavement and gardens, the soil that once held the Calder foundation remains subtly uneven, sinking fraction by fraction each year, as though the ground itself remembers the gravity of what was hidden there. In the spring of 1951, a small construction crew working near the old Broad Street line reported uncovering fragments of a wall that did not appear on any municipal plan. The foreman, a pragmatic man named Charles Brindley, described it as brickwork too fine for a foundation, too deliberate for waste. The pieces were photographed, logged, and carted off to a municipal yard, then quietly misplaced. Yet among the photographs, later rediscovered in the town archives, one image stands out, a narrow opening within the wall, large enough for a person to crawl through, ending in blackness. On the back, someone had written in pencil, "Same depth as the Calder vault." That single note revived the old rumor. A younger generation, unaware of the full story, began to speak again of hidden passages and unmarked graves. The local newspaper published a nostalgic piece titled "Whispers Beneath the Hill," linking the find to Salem's recurring theme of secrecy. The editor inserted a quote from an earlier article about the 1873 investigation, noting Deputy Collings's observation that Salem's silence is not proof of innocence. The phrase, meant as historical flavor, reignited curiosity. Teenagers began daring each other to visit the supposed site after dark. Some claimed to hear faint knocking beneath the soil, others a slow drip like water against stone. One boy, interviewed years later, said he heard a woman's voice repeating the name Lydia. He admitted it might have been the wind, but said he never returned there again. The museum, anxious about renewed attention, issued a short statement denying any link between the excavation and the Calder family, though in private correspondence, curators acknowledged the resemblance of certain artifacts to those listed in Collings' papers. By 1960, redevelopment had erased the visible traces of the property. A narrow street of modern row house has covered what was once the garden, and the rest was paved for parking. Still, maintenance workers occasionally complained that their tools rusted faster near that section, or that dampness lingered in the air even on dry days. An engineer testing the ground for stability found minor subsidence but no cause. He described the soil composition as unevenly salted, inconsistent with inland geography. His report was filed, then quietly shelved. A single copy remained in the building inspector's drawer, annotated in red pencil. Historical site, do not disturb. It was never signed. In the decades that followed, Salem embraced its legends as commerce, turning its ghosts into festivals and souvenirs. Yet locals avoided speaking of the Calder affair, claiming it was different, too modern to be folklore, too faint to be memory. At night, when fog drifts inland from the harbor, the street lamps sometimes flicker in sequence along that forgotten stretch. To most, it's just old wiring. To a few, it's the town's unending pulse, the rhythm that keeps count of what was buried without confession and what still lies beneath, refusing to stay silent. By the early 1970s, Salem's historical committees began digitizing their paper archives, and during that process a junior archivist named Ruth Holloway stumbled across a sealed envelope without a catalog number. Inside were two brittle photographs of the Calder house taken in 1872, both marked with the same wax seal once used by Deputy Collings. The images revealed subtle details, absent from written descriptions. One showed Gilead Calder standing beside the porch, his expression flat, but his right hand holding what appeared to be a rosary. The other depicted Lydia at an upstairs window, her face turned slightly aside, as though caught by surprise. In the background of that second photo, near the edge of the frame, was a pale shape stretched upon the garden soil, so faint it might have been cloth, or perhaps a trick of the early camera's exposure. Holloway enlarged the image and noted faint lines consistent with folds of fabric, not shadow. When she submitted her findings to her supervisor, the envelope was resealed and stored under private donations, provenance uncertain. The photographs vanished during the next year's inventory transfer. Holloway left her position soon after and declined to speak publicly about the discovery, saying only that some histories prefer to remain undisturbed. In 1979, a visiting academic researching post-Puritan guilt in New England, Professor Malcolm Rees, cited the Calder affair as a continuing moral echo, linking it to Salem's long-standing difficulty separating justice from remembrance. He referenced Collings's investigation twice in his manuscript, calling it a mirror of the town's buried conscience. The book was never published. Rees died of a sudden stroke before its completion. The manuscript draft, later found among his papers, included an unfinished sentence. They were not grave robbers by trade, but by inheritance. No context was given. Local rumor, however, seized on the phrase. Over the next decade, trespassers broke into the area's basements claiming to search for tunnels. None were found, but one group in 1983 reported hearing muffled tapping when they struck the wall beneath an old tree root. The sound was rhythmic, like someone keeping time. They fled, leaving behind their flashlights, which were discovered the next morning, batteries drained but bulbs intact. Police dismissed the account, noting the ground's instability, yet the story spread quietly through town. The phrase "hidden family sin" resurfaced once more, printed on a postcard sold briefly in tourist shops until complaints led to its withdrawal. Even now, no official plaque marks the Calder site. It remains a patch of uneven pavement where grass struggles to grow between cracks. Those who walk there after midnight sometimes pause without knowing why, listening as the harbor wind slips through the alleys carrying a faint metallic echo. Steady, deliberate, and patient, as if the earth itself were repeating the ledger that Salem never closed. In the late 1980s, a local historian named David Loring began collecting oral accounts of Salem's lesser-known mysteries. Most were harmless ghost stories, but when he mentioned the Calder name in an interview, the room always changed. Older residents grew still. Younger ones simply said they'd heard it wasn't to be discussed. Loring traced the family through property deeds, ship registries, and church rosters, finding that every official document ended abruptly in 1872. No death certificates, no wills, no transfers, except that forged trust signed by G. Calder himself. What caught his attention most was a margin note in an 1890 census ledger. Property vacant. House withdrawn. The phrasing was bureaucratic nonsense, but he realized it had replaced an earlier line scratched out so deeply the paper tore. Under angled light, he could just make out the original words, "Body found." Loring visited the modern housing development built over the site and interviewed a tenant who complained of saltwater smell rising from the basement after rain. The historian brought a moisture meter. It registered high salinity levels, though the building stood a mile from the coast. He sent soil samples to a university lab, but the report was lost before publication. A clerk later wrote in the margin of the request file, "Return to local archive, no result." Around this time, an elderly woman identifying herself as the granddaughter of Eunice Hart contacted him by letter. She claimed her grandmother's dreams of Lydia Calder by the gate were not dreams at all, but memories of standing outside the house the night it burned, seeing a figure watching from the upstairs window. The family, she wrote, never spoke of it again, but kept one object locked in a trunk, a silver locket containing a photograph of a young woman with half the face torn away. Loring never found the locket. The letter ended with the words, "If you hear the knocking, don't answer." He archived it with his notes and continued his research, citing the Calder case in lectures as an example of the persistence of civic denial. Each talk ended the same way, with him reading Collings's line from the 1870s, "Salem's silence is not proof of innocence." The phrase became something of a refrain, repeated by students who thought it poetic until they visited the site themselves. Some reported that their recordings picked up faint interference there, a low hum rising and falling every 7 seconds. When replayed, it sounded almost like a breath. Loring retired in 1991, leaving behind dozens of labeled reels and a final note in his handwriting. "The air remembers. We just don't listen long enough." After his death, his papers were donated to the town library, but sealed pending review. They remain unlisted, a familiar fate in Salem, where the past is seldom lost, only misfiled on purpose. In the years that followed, the Calder story settled once more into dormancy, surfacing only when the ground itself seemed to insist on being remembered. In 2003, a municipal crew repairing drainage lines beneath Broad Street struck a hollow cavity about 2 meters deep. The foreman reported a sudden rush of cold air, followed by the faint odor of iron and salt. Work was halted for safety review, but by the next morning the hole had filled with water despite dry weather. Photographs taken at the site showed what looked like the curve of a stone arch beneath the surface, too symmetrical to be natural. City engineers classified it as possible historic infrastructure and resealed the trench with concrete. Within a week, the concrete cracked. The incident never made local news, but an anonymous message appeared on an online history forum 2 months later under the name Salem Witness. They paved the Calder vault again. No one traced the poster. What was verifiable came from a later inspection. The moisture readings around the repaired area remained inexplicably high, and vegetation failed to grow there even after soil replacement. A librarian at the Phillips Library, intrigued by the resurfacing rumor, revisited old maritime ledgers and found a single transaction dated 1872, payment from Gilead Calder to a Marblehead shipwright for the preparation and transport of special cargo. The ledger did not describe what that cargo was. It was the first new documentary trace of the family in over a century. She copied it for her files, but months later her office flooded due to a burst pipe. That page, and only that page, was destroyed. She later told colleagues she could still smell seawater in the ink long after it dried. The town, eager to preserve its image as a place of touristic haunt rather than true unease, ignored these alignments. Yet among the maintenance staff, acquit. Its superstition persisted. Never whistle while working near the Broad Street trench, and never dig deeper than the first layer of stone. One worker who did so reportedly left the job after hearing a slow knocking that answered the sound of his shovel. His supervisor dismissed it as echo from the pipes, though he later admitted privately that there were no pipes beneath that section at all. Today the site looks ordinary, just a paved corner between buildings. But each autumn, when fog thickens and the harbor air turns metallic, a thin film of salt appears along the curb, forming faint white veins that glimmer under the streetlights before vanishing with the morning sun. Those who know the story say the ground there still breathes in rhythm with the tide, exhaling its own kind of confession, the echo of Salem's hidden family sin. In 2011, a graduate student from Boston named Clara Duvall arrived in Salem to write her thesis on moral folklore in maritime towns. She had no prior knowledge of the Calder affair until she came across a reference to Deputy I. Collings' Calder matter in a misfiled microfilm of 19th-century constable reports. The line was brief but electrifying, proof that the case had once been official, not merely legend. She began gathering fragments, property transfers, shipping receipts, and court summonses that mentioned the Calder name. The deeper she looked, the more paper vanished from public view. Requests to examine county records were deferred for preservation. The museum denied possessing anything under that name, though one curator privately told her, "You're better off letting that family rest." Duvall persisted, tracing the story through old university catalogs and maritime archives. She found that in 1871, a shipment of anatomical curiosities had been listed as bound for Salem under Calder import trade. The destination entry was left blank, as though someone meant to erase where it ended. That discovery linked the case to broader practices of the time, discreet exchanges between shipping merchants and medical schools eager for specimens. Duvall cross-referenced the date with Salem's local papers and found mention of a fire at the harbor warehouse that same week, destroying certain goods of delicate nature. She wrote in her field notes, "Moral silence disguised as weather." But her research began to unsettle her nights. Neighbors in her boarding house said she woke often, walking the halls with a lantern, saying she smelled the sea. She later admitted in a letter to her advisor that she sometimes heard a steady, hollow rhythm in her room's floorboards when the tide was high. The sound, she said, reminded her of someone knocking to be let out. Her last entry, before she left Salem, read simply, "The records end where the ground begins." She withdrew from her program soon after. The thesis remains unfinished, but her surviving notes were found stacked in the library's return bin a month later, wrapped in a newspaper clipping about the 2003 Broad Street excavation. On the final page, she had copied a single sentence from Collings's old testimony. The daughter speaks as though the walls themselves keep confession. Scholars reviewing her materials years later called her work obsessive yet precise, an example of how history in Salem repeats not through invention, but through discovery, the same facts uncovered, misplaced, and rediscovered again, as though the story refuses erasure. Today, her apartment window faces the harbor. Residents claim she still lives there quietly, collecting tide samples for a study no one has seen. And when the fog rolls in thick and low, those walking past say they sometimes glimpse a faint lantern glow, moving slowly from room to room, steady as breath, pausing only when the sea wind rises and the old city listens once more. By 2018, the Calder affair was little more than a curiosity whispered among archivists and night shift custodians. Salem had become a stage for its own legends, witches sold in plastic, ghost tours mapped by app, but the Calder name remained strangely absent from that theater. Only in private circles did it persist, usually in the cautious tone of professionals who'd seen something that didn't quite fit protocol. That year, a municipal restoration project reopened part of the Broad Street Foundation to install fiber cables. The crew documented their work with photos every hour. One image showed nothing unusual. The next, taken minutes later, captured a faint blur across the frame, pale, vertical, and curved like the fold of fabric in motion. The project lead, reviewing the shots that evening, marked the anomaly as lens interference, yet he deleted the file afterward and refused to return to the site. 2 months later, an electrical fault caused a short in the same conduit line. Workers reported that their voltage meters pulsed erratically, peaking at intervals of 7 seconds, the same rhythm once noted in David Loring's audio tapes. An engineer attributed it to interference from maritime radio frequencies. The locals called it something else. The heartbeat of the buried. One of the maintenance men, a lifelong Salem resident, swore that when he shut off the circuit, he heard 3 slow knocks from beneath the pavement before the hum faded. He refused to be quoted by name. Around that time, a private collector in Marblehead attempted to auction an ivory comb bearing the initials HC. The item was withdrawn before sale, but not before a blurred catalog image circulated online. A museum volunteer recognized the pattern from Collings's century-old report and contacted the auction house. By then, the seller's account had been deleted. The comb's location remains unknown. That same winter, a minor earthquake rattled the harbor, cracking a section of asphalt along Broad Street. Through the fissure, passers-by noticed a faint white crust of salt forming again, as it had decades earlier. The city sealed it within a day. Nothing more was said officially, but one worker claimed that when the last patch of asphalt cooled, it produced a sound like a sigh escaping through a keyhole. Salem, of course, has learned how to package its hauntings, but the Calder case resists such neat containment. It has no ghosts, no curses, only evidence that drifts just out of reach, like a confession half heard through a wall. Even now, those who catalog the archive sometimes pause over unmarked envelopes and faint handwriting, sensing a quiet insistence beneath the dust. They might not name it, but they recognize the cadence. It's the same one that hums through the city's bones when the tide is high, the low, patient rhythm of Salem's hidden family sin, reminding anyone who listens that silence, once chosen, never truly ends. By 2022, the Town Council commissioned a final environmental study of Broad Street after recurring subsidence reports. The hired firm, unfamiliar with the town's folklore, conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey. The preliminary scans revealed irregular voids under the pavement, 3 narrow chambers descending in a line toward the harbor. The technician noted their depth, but stopped the drill when saline moisture flooded the borehole. Later, when the data was reviewed in Boston, the imaging file for that section was corrupted, replaced by static bands that pulsed in a faint rhythmic pattern, 7 seconds apart. The team dismissed it as interference from nearby tram cables, though there were none within range. When a second team arrived a week later, they found the pavement already resurfaced, freshly sealed without order. The city engineer said the work must have been completed by another department, yet no department claimed responsibility. A local paper published a short article about the anomaly, Broad Street repairs completed ahead of schedule, accompanied by a photograph of smooth asphalt gleaming under fog. If one looked closely at the right edge of the image, faint salt crystals traced the outline of what could have been a key or a rosary chain. The photograph was later replaced in the digital archive without explanation. The renewed attention drew Clara Duval, now living quietly by the harbor, back into the conversation. She declined interviews but sent a brief email to a journalist asking whether the voids had been left open. The reporter replied no work was recorded at that depth. Her response was one line, "Then it still breathes." Weeks later, she was seen placing flowers at the seawall, wrapped not in paper, but in an old page from a shipping ledger. Wind tore the sheet before anyone could read it. That winter, a maintenance inspector recorded Fane. The condensation forming along the sealed stretch of pavement despite sub-zero temperatures. The moisture froze into small, regular ridges, 5 in total, evenly spaced, as though shaped by a pulse. The phenomenon lasted a night and vanished by morning. Photos exist, though each shows slight distortion, as if the camera lens had been tugged sideways mid-capture. Today, the site is passed daily by tourists unaware of the ground's restless geometry. Locals cross it quickly, especially when the fog drifts in from the sea and the streetlights dim to that sepia shade familiar from old daguerreotypes. They say if you stop and listen at the edge of the pavement, you can hear something faint beneath, the measured knock of stone against air, patient, deliberate, and calm, as if keeping time for an unfinished record. Salem continues above it, unchanged in appearance, but beneath the asphalt the ledger turns another invisible page, still recording the quiet weight of the Calder name and the unending echo of its hidden family sin. By 2024, Broad Street's resurfaced section had begun to sink again, barely perceptible at first, a shallow depression that deepened each month. City planners blamed water runoff, yet every drainage test returned normal. An elderly resident, once a clerk in the old courthouse, wrote to the local paper claiming that the ground remembers what was written upon it. Her letter was never printed, though it circulated online among amateur historians. One of them, a digital archivist named Thomas Keene, began assembling a timeline of the Calder affair from scattered sources. He collected fragments, deputy reports, journal extracts, lost photographs, and bits of hearsay. The project drew unexpected attention when he posted a clean scan of Collings's last surviving notebook page. Beneath the faint handwriting, modern image software revealed a pressed imprint invisible to the naked eye, 5 words written in a different hand. "We never left the house." The discovery went briefly viral, shared across forums before vanishing after a takedown request from an unknown heritage oversight body. Keene later said his hard drive failed the same night, the data unrecoverable despite multiple backups. In interviews he called it coincidence, though he stopped the project soon after. At the same time, construction workers refurbishing a nearby basement discovered a corroded key wrapped in oilcloth. Its handle bore a single engraved letter, L. When handed to the local museum for authentication, it went missing before cataloging. The staff claimed the envelope was empty when received. Weeks later, salt rings appeared on the floor where it had been placed. Such occurrences have become a quiet rhythm in Salem, appearances followed by swift erasures. A few university researchers still attempt to study them, but access to older municipal records is now restricted, marked under private restoratio. As what endures are the sensory traces, the faint brine that clings to the air after rainfall, the soft vibration underfoot when the harbor tide turns, and the brief dimming of lamps along Broad Street as if the ground itself draws breath. Some call it electrical fluctuation, others collective memory. Yet to those who have read Collings's old notes, the pattern feels intentional, a conversation sustained across centuries between the earth and what it holds. Salem's visitors see only cobblestones and cafes, unaware that beneath them lies a ledger written in pressure, salt, and silence. Locals pass quickly, refusing to linger. For in this city, the past does not rest beneath its soil. It waits, precise as a heartbeat, for the next name to join its unfinished accounting, the endless testament of its hidden family sin. By the winter of 2025, the story had almost disappeared again, buried under construction noise, new shop fronts, and the constant churn of tourism that kept Salem alive. But the ground hadn't forgotten. That January, a survey team scanning subsurface utilities detected something they couldn't explain. A low-frequency vibration emanating from the same Broad Street corridor, pulsing at precise intervals. It wasn't seismic, too regular, too deliberate. The technician, unaware of any legend, recorded the readings and filed them under ambient mechanical interference. 2 nights later, the sensors continued to transmit even after power was cut. The rhythm slowed, then stopped. The log ended with a brief note. Sounded like knocking. The data vanished from the network the next day. Salem's infrastructure office later claimed the system had malfunctioned, yet a janitor who worked the night shift swore he heard footsteps pacing the hall as the data feed flickered out, measured and patient, like someone counting each step before turning back. In March, a maintenance worker cleaning storm drains near the same block found a fragment of ivory among gravel and rust. It bore faint etching, almost erased by time, a letter H followed by what might have been a C. Before it could be sent for analysis, the fragment dissolved overnight in the sample jar, leaving only salt residue. The report was marked incomplete. Soon after, a small sinkhole opened along the curb, revealing a sliver of old brickwork, too deep for modern foundations. The city fenced it off, citing safety. Still, passers-by noted that at dusk, The barrier rattled softly without wind. The mayor called it settling, but older residents avoided the area entirely. One of them, now in her 90s, told a student journalist, "It isn't the dead that haunt this town. It's the things we buried alive in our silence." Her quote never ran. The editor removed the line for being too somber. As the year advanced, Broad Street's pavement cracked again, forming a faint pattern visible only from above, a warped oval like the outline of a locket pressed from beneath. Rain gathered in its groove and shimmered with a dull silver tint before seeping away. Those who have lived longest in Salem say this will happen every few decades, a quiet reminder that the city's conscience has tides of its own. Beneath the lights and the polished storefronts, the earth remains restless, whispering through its fractures the same name, the same confession, the same unfinished record. And though historians may deny it, some nights when fog rolls in from the harbor and the streets fall empty, the sound returns. A calm, steady pulse rising from below, marking time for those who still listen. The enduring rhythm of Salem's hidden family sin. By late autumn of 2025, the fence around the Broad Street sinkhole had become a landmark of sorts. Tourists passed it daily without knowing, snapping photos of the mist that often lingered there longer than anywhere else in town. Locals crossed to the opposite side of the street. The city's maintenance division scheduled repairs 3 times, each postponed after contractors withdrew. "The ground feels wrong," one of them said during a radio interview before his statement was edited out of the broadcast. When rain came, it pooled directly over the hollow, clear at first, then clouded by silt from below, forming a faint spiral pattern before draining away. In early November, an amateur historian live-streamed himself lowering a phone camera through a crack in the barrier. The feed lasted less than a minute. Viewers later described the same image, a narrow chamber of brick descending into darkness, water glimmering at the bottom, and something pale moving slowly in the current, as if fabric drifting with breath. The stream ended abruptly when the signal cut. The video was deleted within an hour, though mirrors of it circulate quietly on private servers. The following week, vibrations were detected again along the same corridor. The pattern was no longer 7 seconds apart but 9, as if something below was slowing its rhythm. Sensors recorded it for 3 nights before silence returned. When a reporter asked the city engineer about the data, he paused and said, "We've decided not to measure there anymore." That decision, unofficial yet absolute, echoed a century of Salem's habit of closing files rather than confronting them. In the archive, a curator sorting uncatalogued donations discovered a sealed envelope with no sender. Inside was a short note written in fountain pen. "We are still keeping watch." The handwriting, compared later to old samples, bore striking resemblance. See to that of Lydia Calder. The ink was modern. Forensic tests were never completed. The envelope went missing before results were filed. Since then, nothing official has emerged. Only small details persist. The smell of brine rising through manhole covers, the faint impression of handprints in the dust on the fencing, the way the streetlights flicker once when the tide turns. Residents now avoid walking that route after sunset, not from fear, but out of a quiet respect for the pattern that Salem itself refuses to break. The Broad Street hollow remains sealed, marked only by a subtle depression in the asphalt. Yet some nights, when fog presses against the windows and the harbor hums with its own pulse, listeners claim they can hear the rhythm again, slow, even, and almost human. It's not a haunting, they say, but a heartbeat, keeping time for the silence this city built upon itself, the endless echo of its hidden family sin. Winter settled heavily over Salem that year, the kind of cold that dulls sound and makes even familiar streets seem distant. Snow buried the Broad Street barrier until it looked like an ordinary mound along the curb. The city announced plans to level the area in spring, citing erosion, but no crew volunteered. In late December, a night guard stationed near the municipal depot filed a brief report. Heard rhythmic tapping beneath ground. Duration 31 seconds. Origin uncertain. The note was logged, stamped, and quietly misfiled within a week. Nothing further was said. Yet people nearby began to notice subtle things. Windows fogged on the inside no matter how dry the air. Street lamps along the old Calder block dimmed one by one when fog rolled in from the harbor, then brightened as if exhaling. Some residents claimed their watches stopped near the site and restarted when they moved away. The pattern repeated every few days, always when the tide was highest. Early one morning, a college photographer setting up for a project caught a long exposure of Broad Street under mist. In the final image, the pavement appeared slightly translucent, the faint suggestion of brickwork visible beneath the surface like an old scar beneath new skin. Experts blamed reflection and lens flare. The file corrupted when he tried to print it. He left town shortly after, telling friends he kept dreaming of standing in waist-deep water, hearing a voice whisper his name in a tone that wasn't cruel, just certain. That spring, the city finally paved over the entire stretch. Asphalt gleamed dark and new, the smell of tar thick in the air. For a month, everything was quiet. Then in April, a postal worker found a small envelope with no return address lying on the curb above the sealed ground. Inside was a single pressed violet wrapped in tracing paper and a card that read, in careful cursive, for D. Deputy Collings. The handwriting was elegant, distinctly old-fashioned. The flower showed no sign of decay despite the humidity. The envelope was handed to city records, placed in a drawer for miscellaneous correspondence, and has not been seen since. Today, the spot looks perfectly ordinary, lined with parking meters and trimmed by new paint. Tourists pass it every hour, phones raised, eyes on the taller myths of Salem. Only the locals pause when the air changes, when the wind drops and the faint smell of salt and iron rises through the pavement. They know it's not the sea. It's the city remembering itself, pulse by pulse, ledger by ledger. And beneath that thin crust of asphalt, something steady continues to count, unseen, unhurried, and unforgiven. The last unending heartbeat of Salem's hidden family sin.